welcome to week 3 of government this fall semester. I am Mr. Chuck, your teacher, and we are going to move forward in history now. Up until this point, we've been talking about the historic forms of government that immediately preceded the United States. Of course, before that, we kind of looked at the very concept of government and how it ties into religion. Now we're going to get to the nuts and bolts of U.S. government by talking about U.S. government, specifically the formation of the government of the United States of America. The chapter calls it an exercise in government building, and that's kind of what we had to do. We had to create this from scratch because, quite frankly, this was like nothing that had been done before in this large of a scale. We talked last week about the democracies that had been set up in Athens and the republic form of government in pre-empire Rome. Those were really the only two examples that the United States had of governments that had anything resembling rights of the people. Again, we didn't have an awful lot to draw on as we tried to come up with this government who ruled for the people, a government that serves the people, not people that serves the government. We'll talk a little bit about the immediate U.S. history before the formation of this government. We'll talk about the one failed attempt or misguided attempt to form the government. And of course, we will close up by looking at my favorite book next to the Bible, the Constitution. Not really a book, it's more of a document, but hopefully you get the idea. We should not think that we flowed immediately out of British monarchy, but British monarchy was in place, and it was the government against whom we were rebelling at the time that our forefathers brought forth this nation. So one of the reasons we talked last week about the British monarchy as it led up to these years in the 18th century is to take a better look at what it was we were opposing at the time. Of course, first permanent U.S. settlement was in Jamestown, 1607. There were various colonies established after that, 1620, the Plymouth Rock colony in what's now Massachusetts. A lot of the motivating factors for the colonists were money. Some of these were business ventures. They thought they could go across the country and had all kinds of land to grow stuff. Tobacco was becoming very popular at that point. And if you've ever seen UK, you have very limited space on which to grow. You go across the ocean, you've got this vast continent on which to grow. So a lot of it was business ventures, trying to find farmland. A lot of it, though, was the search for religious freedom. Now, again, you're starting to see some of the mindset that created the circumstances by where the U.S. government was formed. A few centuries ago, not too many people were thinking about religious freedom. But after Martin Luther and after the Age of Enlightenment came on people, that thought began to cross their minds. The thought, well, if we think the king is not necessarily divinely placed on the throne to rule us, why should we think that the Pope is divinely placed in the Vatican to rule us? A lot of people had already broken away from the Catholic Church and become Protestants. But as this Enlightenment theory continued on, again, more and more of them wondered, why is this person telling me what to do? Why is this government telling me what to do when it comes with religion? So religious freedom and the search for religious freedom was the impetus behind the formation of some of the colonies. Pennsylvania, for instance, under William Penn. Yes, religious freedom, the search for it, was the fundamental reason behind their founding. Now, each of the colonies, as they became to known, again, 13 at the time of the Revolution, each of them had their own government. They kind of did things on their own. They each had a governor that governed that territory, that state. But ultimately, their fealty was to Great Britain. They were still considered citizens of the United Kingdom and subjects of the king. The thing is, though, because they're an ocean away, yeah, they're servants of the king, but the king doesn't have direct daily oversight over them. He'll collect the taxes every so often, but in terms of that immediate daily oversight, there wasn't an awful lot of that. So these colonies were able to to form little economies. They even had currency that worked within their colonies. So they were forming little independent nation states throughout the 17th and into the 18th centuries. Their way of life, of course, was much, much different than your average citizen of the UK. The government in London, though, began seeing, as is usually the case, a potentially increasing source of tax revenue. Hey, these colonists are making some money. They're building farms and even small industry. We got a little cash cow working here. So Britain began increasing the taxes and increasing the oversight on the colonists. Of course, the colonists did not like that very much for obvious reasons. In the immediate years before the American Revolution, there were a couple of very conspicuous acts. I'll just mention, too, the Stamp Act of 1765 went into effect in November. Again, Parliament over here in England approved the tax stamp, which stamps not just taxes, but any shipped goods coming from the United States. And, of course, that was a very lucrative market for the colonists. And, again, the thought that these people over here were doing the work and these people over here were taxing them was very, very offensive to the colonists for obvious reasons. One of the phrases that emerged during pre-revolutionary times was no taxation without representation. Yes, these were considered to be British subjects and UK citizens, but they did not have a vote. They were not represented in Parliament. And so people over here who were not put there by these people are having a say over these people. No taxation without representation. Now, with that as one of the central fuels for revolution and independence, if we look at it in hindsight, King George could have just said, okay, we'll appoint two Parliament representatives to represent the colonies, and that's it. Okay, life goes on. But the theory is that he was proud, like most kings are. If you sit on a throne long enough, it's going to be hard not to get a very inflated opinion of yourself. And King George refused to do the very bare minimum. It's a good exercise in what if to imagine, would the American Revolution have occurred if King George had given a couple of token representatives in Parliament to the colonies? Hard to say, impossible to say for sure, but it is a good mental exercise. These and other events, the Stamp Act gave the colonists, first off, a sense of moral indignation, as you could well imagine, but also it gave them a growing sense of their own power. As they saw Parliament increasingly tax them, number one, they're getting mad, but number two, they're starting to recognize they wouldn't be boosting these taxes if we were not producing some goods, if we were not becoming a lucrative economy ourselves. As part of the colonial protest over Parliament, Parliament granted rights to business to have trade rights with the U.S. So these people over here producing the goods didn't have anyone else to work with. They gave the East India Company a monopoly on the tea market in the colonies, and that led to increasing tea prices. Colonists didn't like it. They had something called the Boston Tea Party. Perhaps you've heard of it. Well, this immediately preceded the first germination of thoughts from these colonists that, hey, we've got a successful economy here. We've got people here. We've got states here. Dare I say we have a nation here? We start to see the first rumblings. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts of 1774. It was the first time that Britain began to recognize the growing rumblings of independence in the colonies, and the Coercive Acts allowed them to bring military forces to the colonies to kind of keep everybody at bay. As we continued on, the colonists over the next couple of years became more adamant as they again noticed more their economic power. The Massachusetts town of Lexington and Concord saw some very heated clashes between British troops and militia. Again, there was no army at this point. A lot of states to this point had formed these groups of able-bodied men to fight off Indian attacks and whatever else may come down the turnpike. Yes, even American soldiers or these militia soldiers had repelled a French invasion in what's now the Detroit area, Michigan, in the French-Indian War, 20-some years before the Revolution. So the colonists were telling Britain, hey, we helped fight a war for you. These guys were encroaching on your territory. We helped beat them back. How about a little respect here? The assembly that formed after the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord recognized that differences were irreconcilable at this point. So there was enough push from colonial leaders to say, we need to form our own nation. First thing you do is you formally declare your independence. In 1775, an assembly met in Philadelphia. They named George Washington to lead an army that had not been formed yet. Again, the Continental Army didn't come into existence later. One of the trusted generals of George Washington was a fellow named Richard Henry Lighthorse Lee of Virginia. His grandson, Robert E. Lee, will come into play much later. As they got together, it was near unanimous from this delegation of business owners and landowners, and they were elites, no doubt about it. It was near unanimous that we need to break away from Great Britain. In order to pen the words of this Declaration of Independence, they hired this writer from Virginia who seemed to be one of the intellectual giants of his time. And he was. You may have heard of him, Thomas Jefferson. Only bad thing about him is he created University of Virginia, and as a Virginia Tech Hokie, I can't like that but so much. That's a joke. Thomas Jefferson is one of the great minds in American history. And of course, for the purpose of this, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. If you read the Declaration of Independence, you cannot help but to go back to what we talked about last week and the Enlightenment, and more specifically, John Locke and his 1690 Treatise on Government. It had a profound influence on Jefferson and the other delegates. All men are created equal. They have rights that the government should not take away, and the purpose of government is to secure these rights. That's your money quote for this week, folks. You can find it at the top of the Declaration of Independence. This right here, this statement made it clear that this nation was going to be like none other before it. The very thought that all men are created equal would have been laughable a couple of centuries before in any quarter of the world. Now, not only are all men created equal, we have rights from God that the government cannot take away. Indeed, the only reason we have government is to secure these rights. That is radical. For the time, that is absolutely radical. Government obtains its power from the consent of the governed. That's radical. The government does not get their power from the Almighty and pass it down to us like there's some munificent gift giver. No, their power comes from us. Again, this is completely upside down thinking in terms of what the world was experiencing or had experienced in the millennia up to this point. This was radical. The idea that the government's role is to secure rights of citizens and that they serve at the pleasure of citizens. Completely unlike anything before. Now, most of the rest of the Declaration is sort of a long list of grievances, the airing of the grievances that the king had committed. And for the first time, these colonies, after the Declaration of Independence was adopted, saw themselves as not British citizens, but American citizens. They saw themselves as a united country, not necessarily 13 separate autonomous colonies. The Declaration of Independence was the first step on that, but of course, as you might imagine, the Declaration of Independence did not sit too well in the UK, and that sparked the Revolutionary War. We won't talk too much about the Revolutionary War right now. We know who won, obviously. But the Declaration of Independence threw down the gauntlet. It left no doubt that this nation that was being formed was going to be unlike any nation before it. We started out, did America, as not so much a constitutional republic. We were not constitutional at all because the first governing document we used was something called the Articles of Confederation. It lasted until 1789. So for about 13 years, we were governed by the Articles of Confederation. Therefore, America operated as a confederation or a kind of a league of independent sovereign states. The Articles of Confederation were very heavy on the rights of the individual states. It was much weaker on the fact that these states are supposed to come together and form a nation. And the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation became evident very quickly. The long list of individual rights was included on there. The state gave state governors, some powers as well, and also, unfortunately, and we will point this out again and again, these rights only applied to white males. Women could not vote, slaves could not vote. So again, these lofty words that we take for granted today were not heeded by the first masters, by the first founding fathers. Again, they were products of their time. I'll grant them that. But we were falling well short of all men are created equal because the only men that were cited in that were white males. It's taken us a long time. We're getting there. The delegates to the Second Continental Congress were the ones that ended up passing the Articles of Confederation, and it was officially ratified in 1781. So that was a 5-year process. This was not easy. The main goal of the Articles was to create as limited a central government as possible. Again, it favored more the independence of the 13 colonies rather than their cohesion as one nation. In the central governing body, there was one Congress, no House or Senate. Each state had exactly one vote. That Congress could not tax people directly. The taxing authority came directly from the state. The Articles provided for no national executive. There was no president under the Articles of Confederation. There was also no setup for a national court system. If you were tried or accused of something, you went under, in this case, Virginia's court system. And once you had exhausted this, there was no Supreme Court that you could appeal to. That was it. Under the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. successfully finished up the war with Great Britain for independence, so it was good in that regard. The treaty recognized the Mississippi River as the western border of the country, the Great Lakes, of course, as the northern border. They passed a series of laws which set up the pattern for establishing territories, states as we will call them. And so the groundwork for the future expansion was laid forward by the Articles of Confederation. So it was not all a failure, but it was a failure in terms of setting up a nation of the United States of America. It provided for a limited government, and as it turned out, it was too limited. There was no way that this country could develop an army if Great Britain decided to come back and get what was theirs. We would have to rely on scattered state militias. You'll recall in the Declaration of Independence, they were able to get the states, because of the urgency of the situation, to put forth X amount of dollars to create this continental army. Still, a lot of militias played a major role. If Great Britain decided to come back now, there was nothing in the Articles of Confederation that would legally compel the states to pay for a national army. That was a big shortfall. It created a political paralysis. For major change to occur, all 13 colonies would have to vote in favor of something. That's a big barrier. It's very difficult to get 13 states to agree with any one thing. So yeah, that's a very hard thing to do. Few people questioned the principles of freedom and limited government called for in the Articles, but more and more people doubted that the freedom alone could continue if, say, a strong leader gained power within a state. Again, the Articles really had no checks and balances to make sure that one faction, if they gained power, would be checked. There was no fail-safe in it, basically. And they quickly learned that. They were very susceptible to cults of personality. The first real evidence of that was Daniel Shays' rebellion. He led a band of armed men in Massachusetts that forced the courts to close in several towns because he was mad that the state legislature was not providing relief to those who fought in the Revolutionary War. And so the state militia of Massachusetts formed and put down the rebellion. But you had the curious situation of Americans taking up arms against Americans, and a government that had no clear way to make sure that this does not happen again. There were still foreign threats as well. Spain owned Florida and was always threatening to increase their territory. Great Britain still owned land west of the Mississippi. Most of that, though, was owned by France. Canada, owned by France. The British still had ports or forts that they were occupying right within sight of America. There was constant foreign pressure on this brand new nation. In 1787, Congress issued a call for a convention for the, quote, sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Question remained whether the states would follow through, whether the states would unify, whether they were interested in losing state authority, because that was clearly the idea here, to form a government that creates a nation and not a confederation of 13 states. After about 4 months of deliberation, they came up with something that is second to the Bible in terms of remarkable human documents. 10,000 years from now, when historians and archaeologists are looking at the artifacts of the United States of America, the one that will draw their interest the most, the one they will talk about the most, is the Constitution. It is that consequential. And again, like I said last week, your teacher loves the Constitution. So if you want to get some brownie points, go pro-Constitution, yes. 39 of the signers put pen to paper and signed the Constitution of the United States. 8 of them had already signed the Declaration of Independence earlier. Then they went to take it to the states for adoption. One of the compromises that came about during the course of trying to sell this to the states was the states obviously were concerned that they would have less autonomy as a state. They were also concerned, quite frankly, that there was not enough protection of individual liberties. And at that point, the Constitution had lined up a system of government with, checks and balances and all that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But there wasn't much that was addressing the individual and what the government could or could not do to the individual. Okay, so they got James Madison back on board, who had written a lot of the Constitution, and he and a team put together 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. We call them the Bill of Rights, and they are crucial. Every one of them addresses individual rights to a degree. And of course, last week we talked about that 10th Amendment that is so important and unfortunately so ignored, that any thing, any issue, any power not specifically given to the federal government is reserved for the states or the people. That's part of the Bill of Rights to the Constitution, and that Bill of Rights helped to sell the document to some states that honestly had some very big objections to it. The next 5 months were a series of compromises, trying to take this Constitution and make it just a little better and more palatable to the states. Remember, all the states have got, the 10 of the 13 rather, have got to adopt this. Some very well-respected people were adamantly opposed to the idea of the Constitution. You've heard of George Mason from Northern Virginia. He was suspicious of all government power. He did not like the idea of a Constitution that would create a federal government with a president. He did not like that idea at all. And that was a stumbling mark, the idea of a president. It reminded them too much of a king. But the supporters of the Constitution pointed out that this president would be nothing like a king, in that he would be voted on by the people, or the Electoral College. We'll get to that in a second. And their power would be restricted by the new Congress they were setting up and by the national judicial system they were setting up. President, Congress, judicial system, executive, legislative, and a kind of semi-sophisticated series of checks and balances, whereby one segment of government cannot become too powerful. They cannot run roughshod. A court cannot all of a sudden make law and enforce law while interpreting it. No, that's not their job. And Congress and the president have the power to check on that. Now, as we look at Congress, of course, the central governing body, the main legislative outlet for this new nation, we talked about under the Articles, there was just one single Congress. Each state got one vote, so basically 13 members of Congress. The framers of the Constitution realized that was completely inadequate for the nation that was being formed. But they wanted to have a legislative body that gave deference to those states that had very, very large populations without dismissing the smaller states. Again, these were 13 independent little quasi-governments here that they're trying to satisfy. So the compromise was to do something that Britain was in the process of doing, establishing a House of Commons and a House of Lords. We called ours the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives are voted on strictly due to population within a state, and they are popularly elected, democratically elected. The Senate, different. State assemblies will choose 2 senators, and the smallest state gets 2 senators. The largest state gets 2 senators. So you have one House of Congress, that is the so-called People's House. People directly vote for them. And the Senate, the state's house. Again, it was much later that people were allowed to vote for their senators. And we're doing that this fall in Virginia. Mark Warner against Daniel Gade. 200 years ago when this country was first founded, would not have been the case. The Virginia General Assembly would have met, and they would have voted on who was going to be Virginia's next senator. So a little bit more democratic than we were originally under the Constitution. Roger Sherman of Connecticut is the one who came up with that 2-house compromise, in case anyone asks you in Trivial Pursuit. Again, the idea of a presidency was a deal breaker for some. They were worried about King Redo being formed there. The compromise was to strictly enumerate and limit president's powers, allowing Congress to override his veto, making him subject to impeachment, removal from office. So yeah, a president, if they got too big for their britches, so to speak, there were ways to get them out of office. The James Wilson of Pennsylvania came up with another idea. The founders did not want direct election of president. They did not want just a popular vote determining who was going to be president of the United States. They wanted this to have a sort of an insulation where people, again, where it was not popularly determined, where they could have some say. They came up with the idea of the Electoral College. And basically, the design is what it is today. State legislatures decided to choose electors by their own popular vote. Now, state legislatures, under the Constitution, they can choose how their electors vote any way that they determine. If they wanted to, they could have the General Assembly say, okay, all of Virginia's 11 votes are going to the Democratic presidential nominee. They could do that, but every state now holds popular elections. Now, there is movement now to award a state's electors to whoever wins the national popular vote. I don't see where that's going to happen anytime soon, because what does that do? That takes away the power of a small state. Right now, if you're Wyoming and you have 3 electoral votes, the voters of Wyoming are going to determine who gets those 3 electoral votes. If Wyoming's popular vote is just thrown into the big pot of popular votes, and they really have no power. They're just throwing their 3 with whomever the people in New York and California decide. So, yeah, but right now, all 50 states choose their electors by popular votes. So it's kind of a 2-tiered process. Voters vote for the electors vote for the president. And, of course, the elephant in the room to all this in terms of developing population and how many seats you get is slavery. Northern delegates usually considered slavery a moral evil, but they generally agreed that this was an issue that should be settled by the states and not this new national government they were setting up. Um, Even though no slave, or no state that is, gave slaves the right to vote for their representatives, they obviously wanted them to count in their population for obvious reasons. They get more seats. Well, the North said, okay, if you want to do that, then we're going to count the slaves in terms of the population that we base our taxes upon. So, if you're going to get them for the purposes of determining representation, you're also going to get this extra population for the determinant of taxes. Well, obviously the South didn't like that. We only want to count them for the vote, not for the. So something had to be done. The Three-Fifths Compromise came along, and for the purposes of representation and for the purposes of taxation, each slave would be counted as three-fifths. Now, as we fast forward to today, the idea of thinking of a human being as a 60% number is repugnant to us, and I hope it always remains repugnant. But for the purpose of teaching this, we have to tell how it went down. And the Three-Fifths Compromise was one of the reasons the Constitution was eventually adopted. Another thing the Constitution did was 20 years after ratification, it stopped the import of new slaves. So you can start to see, even at the formation of the nation, that idea, that inkling in the minds of people that, this thing that man has been doing since the dawn of time, it might be wrong. We might have been wrong for these 5,000 years. They were. But we're just seeing the beginnings of that thought germinate. Even though they, particularly in the North, grudgingly accepted the idea of slavery at the time, they didn't want to make it any worse than it had to be. So they eventually got into the Constitution the fact that the slave trade, or importing of slaves, would end 20 years after ratification, and that's exactly what happened in 1808. So the good news is they got the Constitution ratified eventually, but the bad news is, in terms of slavery, they didn't really address the problem. They just kicked the can down the road for leaders to struggle with much, much later. You can tell even at this point there's a sensitivity about the subject and the beginnings of understanding the absolute hypocrisy of viewing a fellow human being as less than human. People were starting to wake up. And it's an interesting thing to see people en masse start to change their mind about something. Again, we have 200 plus years of hindsight. We have the luxury to ask, what the heck were they thinking? And we do, and we should. But when you think about that, again, this nation was already, the idea behind it was so far advanced of other nations, it's a shame we could not have moved slavery along that same path to have an advanced view on slavery that would come into vogue across the world in really only a few decades. But they didn't. Owing to the sensitivity of the subject, they basically kicked the can down the road. Indeed, the Constitution of the United States did not even mention the word slavery until the 13th Amendment, adopted after the Civil War. Constitution answered one crucial question: how strong should the central government be? Well, the obvious answer is strong enough to do what it needs, but not so strong that it threatens the rights and freedoms of states and of individual Americans. The Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, had demonstrated themselves as to be not strong enough to do what it needed to do. So therefore, the Constitution gave the federal government more power, but it not stripped that power, but it delegated that power in such a different way that no one group controlled a monopoly. No one had a monopoly on power. Three things to remember here: delegated powers, separation of powers, and checks and balances. Delegated powers are specific, enumerated delegated powers that are given to the national government. Again, we talked about the 10th Amendment. Those powers specifically delegated to the federal government. That's what they're talking about here. It creates what's called, and this was almost a new word at the time, federalism. I like federalism. It describes a form of government that has divided sovereignty. In this case, the states have their things they get to do. The national government has their things that they get to do. Now, there are some that cross in the middle, as you're looking here at this graphic. There are some duties that are shared by the state and federal government, but there are those also that are specifically left to these two entities. That is called federalism. That is something we all too often overlook today because of expediency, because of our desire to want it now, 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 now. And federalism is not honored like it used to be. Separation of powers. We understand the concept: the legislative, the judicial, the executive. Legislature makes the laws, the executive carries out or enforces the laws, and the judicial applies and interprets the laws. This separation of powers creates that wonderful thing called checks and balances. I freaking love this. I love when we had divided government. I don't like it when one party controls the Congress, presidency, the Supreme Court, or the court system, or whatever. I like it when it's divided. I like when checks and balances are healthy. Now, the checks and balances, for example, president can administer executive orders, administrative rules from government agencies, sometimes get around all this. The examples of checks and balances: the president has the power to negotiate treaties and to make appointments, but the Senate has to approve them before they go into effect. Congress can pass a law, but the president can veto. Congress can override the veto with a 2/3 majority. The Supreme Court interprets the laws, but the president nominates the members of the Supreme Court, as we're finding out now, and the Senate has to approve those nominations. So all three of the branches of government are involved in the process of filling the U.S. Supreme Court. The people and the Electoral College choose the president. Federal judges can hold office for life. Congress, though, does have the power to impeach and remove from office the president, vice president, any federal judge, and any civil officer of the United States. So this series of checks and balances to make sure that no one branch gets too powerful. I would submit, this is my opinion, over the past few decades, Congress has given up a lot of their power of checking the president and the court system. And I think Congress has done it on its own. Congress is unwieldy. It's 535 people. You have to agree on something. And if there's not, wide unanimous approval, you can see how that can be very, very time consuming. But because of that, unfortunately, Congress has let some of their power slip away. And I think if we're going to be truly healthy, Congress has to reestablish its powers that are granted to it by the Constitution. The result of the Continental Congress was a national government that was stronger than what it had been under the Articles of Confederation, but not so strong that state governments had withered into insignificance. State governments still had power. They still had plenty of authority. But this Constitution gave us a national government, which is what we required. Now, when it came time to sell the idea of the Constitution, the Federalists, that is, the pro-Constitution people, were very, very organized and communicated their vision of government well. They drew up what's called the Federalist Papers, series of letters to the editor, so to speak, that they put in publications throughout the new United States. Very, very compelling. Now, there were some very high-profile people that were worried and opposed the Constitution. Perhaps you've heard of Sam Adams of Massachusetts, maybe Patrick Henry of Virginia. They were the best-known opponents of constitutional ratification. Again, they were worried chiefly about individual rights being made secondary. Of course, the Constitution was eventually ratified, and 200-plus years later, here we are. The Constitution was a product of its times. It was a response to America's experience being a colony under Great Britain. It also reflected the Enlightenment philosophy that was blossoming at the time. Not a truly democratic document because it does not have direct democracy like we saw in Athens, where, again, everybody meets to vote on everything. It wasn't a direct democracy. And it accepted the practice of slavery and did not address it. It also did not allow non-whites or women to vote. So it fell short of its own lofty ideals. But it has served as the model for our government, and indeed has served as the model for constitutions in many, many other countries. The framers, to their credit, were obviously thinking about more than the here and now. They were thinking about down the road. Is this going to stand the test of time? They based the Constitution on ideals of fairness and equality under the law. They also put into the Constitution the flexibility to be amended when needed. The apocryphal story goes, after the Continental Congress met for the final time, Ben Franklin, 81 years old at the time, came out of the building, and a woman in Philadelphia asked him, "What have you been making?" He said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." Well, we've indeed kept our republic, our commitment to the principles that are embodied in this wonderful, wonderful Constitution. A couple of words about the role of faith in all this. There is a kind of a new effort underway to cast the Founding Fathers as something other than Christian, which is really a fool's errand. You cannot look at the Constitution and not see the seeds of Christian thought sowed all through it. Now, the Articles of Confederation and the Declaration of Independence specifically mentioned God, and we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. God is not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. There's lots of theories about why that may be the case. My theory is that it was sort of understood at that point. They had included God in every other founding document, and when it came to drawing up the Constitution, they did not feel the reason, any compulsion to point to God, thinking it was just sort of understood. One thing the Constitution did in terms of religion is that it went to great pains to make darn sure that the United States of America did not have a national religion. They consciously chose to make us not an officially Christian nation or Catholic nation. They went to great pains to include religious freedom. Remember, those colonists, a whole bunch of them are here in the first place because of religious freedom and the desire for that. So anyway, of course, the spread of Christianity and various sects of Christianity was the reason these colonies were founded in the first place. Many of the Founding Fathers openly avowed their faith. Many of them were Christian. Some were not. The Massachusetts Bay representatives were very much Puritan. Not all the Founding Fathers were Christians. Ben Franklin was not. Thomas Jefferson was what's called a deist. He believed in God. He believed in design and whatnot. He did not believe that our God takes a day-to-day role in our lives, that God is more of a hands-off. Thomas Paine was another one of those who believed in God, but not necessarily in Christianity. The founding generation, though, clearly set the precedent for reliance on God. The seeds of Christianity are planted all throughout the Constitution. Most Americans today would not endorse every position of the founders on every issue. Again, we would be very much opposed to their positions on slavery and on women. However, one thing we do agree about today, as thinking has moved on, is we agree they nailed it when it came to religion. They had the proper and important role of religion in public life. You allow it to, as long as it doesn't bother anyone else, and you do not establish a state religion. We're going to close this week with a few minutes of looking at the wonderful preamble to that Constitution. "We, the people of the United States," tells us the source of government. Not the government, the people. That's where the power comes from. The Constitution was the result of a relatively new and wholly radical idea. Government comes from the consent of the governed. Government does not come from God. These people were not put there by God. They're put there by us. The union of the states and the federal government come from the people, not the states themselves. The Constitution is an example of a covenant, a contract that people meet about and agree to. We enter into an agreement. These truths will tell us we have a long way to go in fulfilling the noble idea of we the people, but we're moving in that direction, and we need to move more quickly. The second part, in order to form a more perfect union, the Articles of Confederation were what they were, but they were insufficient. In that quest to form a more perfect union, an improved version, we came up with the Constitution. It was the intention of the founders for this to be a permanent thing. Again, they were thinking long term about this. This was not going to be something that lasted a generation and then they'd have to willy-nilly change it all again. No, this was built with the long term in mind. When the country began, it consisted of 13 states hugging along the eastern seaboard, stretching west of the Mississippi River. But they envisioned a time when this nation would cover most of the continent, and the Constitution was written with that in mind. The next part, establish justice. Constitution created our first national system of law and courts. The Articles of Confederation made no mention of this. Civil society, of course, requires that individuals be protected, that their rights be protected, that wrongdoers be prosecuted. Remember, what did we say in the first week? The most important thing government can do when it comes to securing rights? The protection of private property. A judicial system is the keystone of that. We appreciate a system of justice most when we see what happens when one does not exist. In such cases, as we see overseas sometimes, an individual citizen is helpless against the power of the government. We will hopefully never, ever know what that feels like. That's got to be terrible. To ensure domestic tranquility, well, just like we need justice, we also need something resembling domestic order. We mentioned Shays' Rebellion, and yeah, there were other rebellions that did occur. One very big one in the 1860s, as you'll recall. But to ensure domestic tranquility indicated that this was one of our goals. And where domestic tranquility was not upheld, it is the government's duty to step in and make it so. To provide for the common defense, the defense of the homeland. Remember, we're getting just a few years away from a ragtag group of Continental Army and militias and citizens and whatnot being able to hold off one of the world's great military powers. So the founders saw the need for a strong defense of our homeland. Even as the Constitution was being written, there were several countries that were sort of benching in, wanting to get some of their property back. Looking at you, Great Britain. But at the time, we depended a lot on state militias and states responding to requests for funding for Congress. Of course, the Constitution recognizes diplomacy is always preferable to engaging in open conflict or war. But it recognizes that if we're going to be a nation, we're going to have the means to defend ourselves. To promote the general welfare, let me get it right. This is a very broad phrase, that is. It says the federal government should promote the general well-being of the country. Now, that sounds great. That's why have a government if you're not going to promote the general welfare? Unfortunately, this is a phrase that can be and sometimes is abused. It all depends upon how you define the general welfare. Does the U.S. government have power to make sure we have only safe foods on the market? Do they have the power to ensure the safety of cars and trucks? If you take this to the nth degree, you could make the argument that, hey, we pay a lot as a society for medical bills for people who can't afford it. Therefore, it would ease our tax burden if people were healthy. Therefore, we could, for the common good, for the general welfare, we could make exercise mandatory. We could force people to stop eating unhealthy foods. Hey, it's for the common good. It's for the general welfare. You see how that could be abused? Fortunately, we avoid welfare that benefits a very specific group in that. But keep in mind, promoting the general welfare, again, great idea, super idea. It can be abused very easily. We have to watch it. And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. This was the most obvious proof that the founders intended this to last for ourselves and our posterity. They were thinking more of a government that was going to serve them until they got old and withered. It was going to serve their kids and their kids and their kids. Our actions are different if we're thinking about more than the here and now. Our actions are different if we are doing things that will impact not only us, but the people we love. Our actions become different if we realize they will reverberate throughout time. Our actions become better, hopefully, under those circumstances. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. To ordain is to create or to officially invest in. When someone is ordained, a church or a group of people is officially, spiritually investing in that person. This is our government. We have a responsibility and an obligation to help our government be the best it can be for ourselves and our posterity. Next week, we're going to look at components of this wonderful constitutional guided government as we dive headfirst into Congress. Hopefully this loads up quickly, and I will see you guys on Monday.